The morning sun painted long shadows across Main Street in Cedar Grove, as Sheriff James Jamie Carson stood at his office window, watching the first hints of dawn creep over the Appalachian foothills. 3 weeks into his role as the youngest sheriff in Pine Ridge County's history, and already the weight of responsibility pressed down on him like the humid mountain air. His reflection stared back at him from the window, clean-shaved, determined hazel eyes, and a badge that some folks said he'd gotten more around. Saldi bearer, frasa ridasa piro. Tikunder nuntaper, the tirada rinader no. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Another hit last night, Sheriff, Deputy Rachel Torres announced, dropping a manila folder onto his desk. Her voice carried that familiar edge of skepticism, the same tone he'd been hearing since the county commissioners chose him over more seasoned candidates. The Miller's General Store, Iron Wolves left their calling card, that chrome wolf head spray-painted across the front window. Third business this month, and it's only getting worse. Jamie picked up the file, studying the photos with eyes that missed nothing. The Millers weren't just business owners. They were the kind of people who kept credit tabs open during hard winters, who remembered every customer's name, who'd given him his first job stocking shelves when he was 16. Old Man Miller had even let him practice his shooting out back during lunch breaks, setting up tin cans on fence posts. The images showed shattered glass, overturned shelves, and that gleaming wolf head symbol, its metal flake paint catching the camera flash like real chrome. They're getting bolder, Chief Deputy Mark Sullivan observed, his weathered face grim as he joined them. 30 years on the force had left silver threading through his dark hair and deep lines around his eyes. Started with vandalism, moved to protection rackets. Now they're targeting businesses that mean something to the community. State police, called again, offering tactical support. Maybe it's time we considered it, son. The suggestion hung in the air like gun smoke, a subtle reminder that many thought the young sheriff was in over his head. Even the way Sullivan called him son carried an edge of doubt. Jamie spread the crime scene photos across his desk, eyes moving with a precision that few noticed. Where others saw random destruction, he saw patterns, angles, trajectories. His time as a competitive marksman hadn't just taught him how to shoot, it had trained him to see what others missed. No, he replied firmly, tapping one particular photo. The Iron Wolves are making mistakes, and bringing in outside help would only prove what they're trying to tell this town, that we can't handle our own problems, that they're stronger than us. Enlighten us, rookie. Torres leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. What could you possibly see that 40 years of combined law enforcement experience is missing? These are hardened criminals, not target practice. Jamie pointed to the wolf head tag, his finger tracing the spray pattern with the same precision he once used to map wind conditions on the shooting range. Look at the details. Their usual artist, Chrome King Martinez, is right-handed. We know this from security footage at the gas station incident last week. This tag was painted by someone left-handed. He grabbed a ruler, making quick measurements with competition-honed accuracy. And King is 6 feet 4 inches tall. This was sprayed by someone much shorter, around 5'9". The angle of the paint drops tells us everything. Sullivan leaned in closer, his skepticism giving way to curiosity. The old deputy had seen enough in his 3 decades of service to know when someone was shooting straight with him, both literally and figuratively. Go on. What else are we missing? The Iron Wolves are fracturing, Jamie continued, pulling up photos from previous incidents and arranging them with methodical precision. These aren't coordinated attacks anymore, they're power plays. Victor the Vice Rodriguez is challenging Derek Chrome King Martinez's leadership. That's why these hits are getting messier, more frequent. They're not just trying to intimidate the town, they're trying to prove themselves to each other. Look at the escalation pattern. It's not about maximizing damage anymore. It's about making statements. The conversation was interrupted by Martha Miller bursting into the office, her usual gentle demeanor replaced by barely contained fear. Her hands trembled as she clutched her worn apron, a habit Jamie remembered from his teenage years working at the store. "Sheriff, they threatened my grandson. Two of them at the store this morning said if we don't start paying protection money, they'll make sure little Tommy never makes it to baseball practice again. The same Tommy you used to babysit when you worked for us. The store wasn't just any business. It was Cedar Grove's beating heart." 4 generations of mountain folk had relied on Miller's General Store for everything from fishing tackle to fever medicine. The worn wooden floors had creaked under the boots of miners, farmers, and families since before Jamie was born. The iron wolves had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Jamie stood, checking his holster with practiced efficiency. The same motion he'd performed countless times during his years as a competitive shooter, long before he'd ever pinned on a badge. The familiar weight of his competition-grade Remington 1911 against his hip wasn't just reassuring. It was a reminder of countless hours on the range of trophies earned and records set that none of his deputies knew about. "They think I'm a joke," he said quietly. "A rookie sheriff who got lucky. But every time they underestimate me, they make another mistake. And this time, they just made their biggest one yet. Threatening a child in my town. That's not just crossing a line. That's asking for a response." Outside his window, storm clouds gathered over the Appalachian peaks, promising thunder. In Cedar Grove, storms had always been a warning to take shelter. But this time, the coming storm wouldn't be the one doing the damage. It would be the rookie sheriff they'd all underestimated, and the precision skills he'd kept hidden like a round in the chamber, waiting for the right moment to take his shot. In the competitive shooting world, they'd called him Eagle Eye for a reason. Soon, the Iron Wolves would learn why that nickname had made other shooters forfeit matches rather than face him on the range. Cedar Grove wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. Nestled in the embrace of the Appalachian Mountains, it was a town where morning mist carried the scent of pine needles and fresh-baked bread from O'Malley's bakery, mingling with the rumble of logging trucks heading up to the old mountain roads. For generations, the biggest excitement came from high school football games and the annual Mountain Heritage Festival, where old-timers still competed in marksmanship contests that dated back to frontier days. The festival's shooting competition had been a Carson family tradition for 3 generations, though few knew just how far that tradition had carried the current sheriff. Jamie Carson knew every inch of these mountains, every bend in the roads that wound through the hollows and valleys. He'd grown up watching his father compete in those shooting contests, learning the way wind moved through the mountain passes, how to read distances in the landscape's subtle changes. What most folks didn't know was that those same skills had taken him far beyond Cedar Grove's borders, earning him titles and trophies that now gathered dust in his attic. 17 national medals, 4 state records, and a reputation that had made him legendary in competitive shooting circles, all carefully kept quiet when he'd returned home to pin on the badge. "Morning, Sheriff," called Bill O'Malley, setting out fresh pies on the bakery windowsill. His grandfather had opened the shop in 1932, and the recipe for his famous mountain berry pie was still a family secret. "Heard about the Miller place? Shame what's happening to this town." The baker's usually cheerful face carried shadows of worry, his eyes darting to check the street before speaking further. "My daughter Kelly saw those bikers circling the high school yesterday. Never used to have to worry about such things here. Used to be the worst trouble we had was Tommy Jenkins stealing pies off this very windowsill." Jamie paused, noting how O'Malley's hands trembled slightly as he arranged his pastries. The Iron Wolves were affecting more than just businesses. They were changing the very rhythm of Cedar Grove's life. Kids were being walked to school instead of riding bikes, shopkeepers were closing early, and the evening strolls along Main Street had all but disappeared. The summer concert series in the park had been canceled for the first time in 50 years, and even Sunday church attendance was down as people grew wary of gathering in groups. Inside O'Malley's, the usual morning crowd nursed coffee cups, speaking in hushed tones about the latest incidents. Judge Harrison, who'd presided over the county court for 3 decades and had been a close friend of Jamie's father, sat in his usual corner booth, newspaper spread before him. His wire-rimmed glasses and bow tie were as much a part of Cedar Grove as the mountains themselves. "Sheriff," he called out. "Got a minute?" Jamie slid into the booth, noting how conversations quieted around them. The judge had been one of the few who'd supported Jamie's appointment despite his age, remembering perhaps how the young man's father had once saved his life during a hunting accident with a shot most would call impossible. "These Iron Wolves," Harrison said quietly, "they're not just any gang. My contacts in the federal courthouse say they've been moving up the coast, taking over small towns like ours. 3 communities in West Virginia already fell under their control. Police chiefs resigned, businesses closed, people moved away. They've got a system, Jamie. They break a town's spirit before they break its laws." "That won't happen here," Jamie replied, his voice carrying the same steady certainty he'd once used to calculate windage at 1,000-yard ranges. His hand unconsciously touched the worn spot on his belt where his competition holster used to ride. "No?" The judge raised an eyebrow, pushing his coffee aside. "Because you've got some plan? Or because you're too young to know better? I supported you for this job because I knew your father, knew how he raised you. But even John Carson would think twice about taking on an outfit like this alone." Before Jamie could respond, Sarah Chen from the local paper slipped into their booth. Her notebook was already out, pen poised. She'd moved to Cedar Grove 5 years ago to run the Mountain Herald, bringing big city journalism instincts to small town stories. "Sheriff, care to comment on rumors that the county commissioners are considering requesting state intervention? Sources say your age and inexperience are causing concern, particularly after what happened in Millbrook County when the Iron Wolves took control there." The diner fell silent, all eyes turning to their young sheriff. Jamie took a deliberate sip of coffee, his mind calculating angles and approaches just as he'd done in competition. Through the window, he could see the mountains that had taught him everything he knew about patience, about waiting for the perfect moment to take a shot. "Ms. Chen, you've lived here, 5 years now? Long enough to know Cedar Grove isn't just any town. We've weathered floods, fires, and economic downturns. We've done it by standing together, not by asking outsiders to solve our problems. But these aren't natural disasters," she pressed, her pen scratching across the notepad. "These are organized criminals with a history of violence. Sources say they've gotten backing from bigger outfits using small towns like ours as training grounds for larger operations. They've got connections all the way up to the state capitol, according to some reports." Jamie leaned forward, his voice low but carrying in the hushed diner. "You want a story, Sarah? Here's one. In 1892, when coal companies tried to force our miners to accept company scrip instead of real wages, Cedar Grove didn't bow down. In 1957, when timber barons tried to claim our communal hunting grounds, this town stood its ground. The Iron Wolves think they're facing a rookie sheriff and a bunch of small-town folks. They're about to learn what mountain people are made of. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The conversation was interrupted by the roar of motorcycles passing outside. Through the window, Jamie counted 6 bikes, their chrome wolf head emblems catching the morning sun. The riders moved slowly, deliberately, a show of force meant to intimidate. But they didn't notice how the young sheriff's eyes tracked their movement, noting makes, models, and rider positions with competition-trained precision. Years of reading wind patterns and calculating bullet trajectories had taught him to see details others missed. "You seem awfully confident," Judge Harrison observed after the bikers passed. "Want to share why? Because right now, confidence isn't enough. These people have destroyed other towns, son." Jamie stood, leaving money for his coffee. "Judge, remember those shooting competitions my dad used to take me to? There's something about them I never told many people. By 18, I wasn't just competing. I was setting state records. They called me Eagle Eye on the circuit, and it wasn't just because I could hit a target. It was because I could read a situation, calculate every variable, and make impossible shots look easy. Those trophies in my attic aren't just for show. They're proof that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous." He moved to the window, watching the bikers disappear around the corner. "The Iron Wolves are used to bullying towns into submission, but they've never faced someone who spent 10 years learning how to turn pressure into precision. They see a rookie sheriff. I see target practice waiting to happen." Thunder rumbled in the distance as Jamie stepped out onto Main Street. The morning crowd watched through O'Malley's windows as their young sheriff walked the same path the bikers had taken, his steps measured and confident. In Cedar Grove, storms had always been more than just weather. They were omens, warnings, promises, and right now they were announcing that change was coming to these ancient mountains, carried not on the wind, but in the steady hands of a sheriff who knew that sometimes the best way to protect a community was to become the weapon it needed most. Jamie's boot heels echoed on Cedar Grove's sidewalk as he made his morning rounds, the sound mixing with distant thunder rolling through the mountain passes. The Iron Wolves' motorcycles had long since faded into the distance, but their presence lingered like smoke after a forest fire. Shop owners watched him pass with a mixture of hope and doubt in their eyes, each wondering if their young sheriff could really stand against the storm that was brewing. "Sheriff Carson?" The call came from Eddie Chen, Sarah's teenage son, who worked weekends at the local gun shop. The boy was running full tilt down the street, panic clear on his face. "They're at Davidson's shop, the Iron Wolves. They're tearing the place apart." Davidson's Sporting Goods wasn't just any store. It was where Jamie had bought his first competition pistol, where old Jack Davidson had taught him the finer points of trigger control and breath management. The shop had been a fixture in Cedar Grove for 40 years, supplying everything from hunting rifles to competition gear. More importantly, it was one of the few businesses that hadn't given in to the Iron Wolves' demands for protection money. Jamie broke into a controlled run, his mind already mapping angles and approaches. Davidson's shop sat at the corner of Pine and Market, a solid brick building with large display windows. As he rounded the corner, the scene unfolded like a target presentation at a shooting competition. Every detail crystal clear, every potential threat assessed with practiced precision. 3 motorcycles were parked out front, their chrome wolf head emblems gleaming in the morning light. Inside, through the partially shattered front window, Jamie could see 2 Iron Wolves members destroying display cases while a third held Jack Davidson at gunpoint. The old man was on his knees, blood trickling from a cut above his eye, but his spine was straight as a rifle barrel. "Last chance, old man," one of the bikers growled, loud enough to carry through the broken glass. "Either you start supplying us with what we need, or we make sure you never sell another gun in this county." Jamie's hand moved to his sidearm, but he forced himself to wait. In competition, rushing a shot was the surest way to miss. He needed more information, better angles, a clearer picture of the situation. His eyes scanned the scene, noting potential cover, line-of-sight issues, and civilian positions with the same methodical precision he'd once used to evaluate shooting stages. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, phones out, recording everything. Deputy Torres pushed through them, hand on her weapon. "Sheriff," she whispered, "state police are 10 minutes out. Maybe we should wait." "In 10 minutes, they could kill Jack and be halfway to the county line," Jamie replied, his voice steady. "Besides, we don't need state police. What we need is to show Cedar Grove that these wolves aren't as tough as they pretend to be." He stepped forward, positioning himself where the morning sun would be behind him, casting his shadow long across the sidewalk. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used to quiet doubters at shooting competitions. "I believe Mr. Davidson's made his position clear. Now you've got about 10 seconds to release him and exit his property." The Iron Wolves turned, surprise giving way to sneers when they saw the young sheriff standing alone. The leader, a heavily tattooed man Jamie recognized as Marcus Chainsaw Thompson, stepped forward. His jacket patches identified him as part of Victor Rodriguez's faction. "Well, if it ain't the baby-faced sheriff," Chainsaw laughed. But Jamie noticed how the man's hand drifted toward the pistol poorly concealed under his vest. "Heard you were young, but damn, they are giving badges to high schoolers now?" "Funny," Jamie replied, not moving an inch. "I was just thinking they must be desperate for members recruiting from the retirement home. Your hands are shaking so bad I'm surprised you can hold that gun straight." The taunt hit home. Chainsaw's face darkened, and Jamie saw the subtle shift in his stance that telegraphed his intentions. In competition, Reading these tiny tells had helped him shave fractions of seconds off his time. Here, it might save lives. "You got a smart mouth, boy," Chainsaw snarled. "Maybe it's time someone taught you some respect. Like you taught respect to the Miller kid." Jamie's voice carried an edge now. "Threatening children, destroying businesses, terrorizing old men. You boys must be real proud of yourselves. But here's something you should know about Cedar Grove. We take care of our own." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Behind Chainsaw, his two companions had moved away from Davidson, spreading out in a classic flanking pattern. They thought they were being tactical, but to Jamie's trained eye, they were just making themselves easier targets. "Last warning," Jamie announced, his right hand relaxed but ready near his holster. "Drop your weapons, step outside, and we can handle this civilized. Otherwise, you're about to learn why they used to call me Eagle Eye on the competition circuit." Chainsaw's laugh was ugly. "Competition circuit? This ain't some shooting game, boy. This is real life, and in real life, 3 beats 1 every time." "Interesting theory," Jamie replied, noting how the morning wind was picking up, carrying the scent of approaching rain. "Want to test it?" The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring. In the distance, thunder rolled through the mountains again, closer now. Jamie felt the familiar calm settling over him, the same peace he'd found on the competition range when everything narrowed down to angles, timing, and the perfect moment to take a shot. Chainsaw's hand twitched toward his gun. In the frozen fragment of time before violence erupted, Jamie allowed himself a small smile. These iron wolves were about to learn the difference between thugs with guns and someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of precision under pressure. The storm was about to break over Cedar Grove, but it wasn't the thunder they needed to worry about. It was the lightning that came without warning, striking with deadly accuracy. What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Grove for years to come. Later, witnesses would struggle to describe exactly what they saw, the movements too quick, too precise to follow with untrained eyes. But this is what they all agreed on. Chainsaw never even cleared his holster. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, so close together they almost sounded like a single report echoing off the brick buildings. The first bullet knocked Chainsaw's weapon clean out of his hand before his fingers could even wrap around the grip. The second sent the gun of his right-hand man spinning across the floor. The third disarmed the final Iron Wolf with surgical precision, leaving all 3 men standing frozen, hands still positioned where their weapons had been moments before. "That's 3 shots," Jamie said quietly, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. "1 for each gun. Would you like to see what I can do with the other 12 rounds in my magazine?" Deputy Torres stood slack-jawed, her own weapon still half-drawn. In all her years of law enforcement, she'd never seen shooting like that. "Sheriff," she whispered, "how did you—" "Check on Jack." Jamie cut her off, his aim never wavering from the 3 bikers. "And someone might want to collect those weapons before our friends here get any more bright ideas." The crowd that had gathered burst into excited chatter. Sarah Chen's pen flew across her notepad, while Eddie recorded everything on his phone. Through the broken window, old Jack Davidson had pulled himself to his feet, a fierce grin splitting his bloodied face. "Damn, boy," the old gunsmith called out. "Guess all those hours on my range paid off after all. Though you never showed shooting quite like that back then." Chainsaw's face had gone from shocked to furious. "You have any idea what you just did? The Iron Wolves don't take kindly to being humiliated. Victor Rodriguez is going to what?" Jamie interrupted, his tone conversational but carrying an edge sharp as a razor. "Send more men for me to disarm? Maybe come himself? I hope he does, because right now, every phone in this crowd is recording, and by nightfall every Iron Wolf from here to the state line will know exactly what happened. They'll learn that their tough guy act doesn't work so well against someone who can shoot the antenna off a motorcycle at 50 yards without scratching the paint." As if to prove his point, Jamie's next shot cracked through the air without warning. The wolf head emblem on Chainsaw's motorcycle suddenly had a perfect hole through its eye, the precision of the shot making it look almost deliberate, like a signature. "That's for," Jamie continued calmly, Want to see 5. Torres had finished collecting the dropped weapons, checking each one with professional efficiency. All clear, Sheriff. State police are 2 minutes out. Plenty of time, Jamie replied, his aim never wavering. So let me make something clear to our guests here. That shot just now? That's the kind of accuracy that won me my first state championship at 19. But here's what you don't know. I was taking it easy then. Had to be sporting, you see. Competition has rules. Out here? He gestured with his free hand to the mountains looming behind them. Out here, we play by mountain rules. From inside the shop, Jack Davidson let out a wheezing laugh. Mountain rules. Boy, you sound just like your daddy now. Remember what John used to say about mountain justice? Swift as lightning, sure as thunder, Jamie quoted, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Though Dad never had to deal with wannabe outlaws threatening kids and terrorizing shopkeepers. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Chainsaw and his men had lost their swagger, looking more like scolded schoolboys than hardened criminals. The crowd had grown, word spreading through Cedar Grove's rapid small-town grapevine. Among them, Jamie spotted Judge Harrison and Bill O'Malley, both wearing expressions that mixed pride with astonishment. State police will be here soon, Jamie announced. They'll process you, book you, and eventually release you. When that happens, I want you to deliver a message to Victor Rodriguez. Tell him Cedar Grove isn't like other towns. Tell him what you saw here today, and most importantly, tell him that the next time his iron wolves want to cause trouble in my jurisdiction, I won't be aiming at guns or emblems. The threat hung in the air, made more potent by its quiet delivery and the demonstration of skill that preceded it. Thunder rolled through the mountains again, closer now, nature's own punctuation to the sheriff's words. As Torres began reading rights and applying handcuffs, Judge Harrison made his way to Jamie's side. That was quite a show, son. But you know you've just painted a target on your back. The Iron Wolves won't take this lying down. Good, Jamie replied, finally holstering his weapon. I'm counting on it because now they'll be angry and angry people make mistakes. And if there's one thing competition taught me, it's how to capitalize on mistakes. Sarah Chen pushed forward, her reporter's instincts sensing there was more to the story. Sheriff, where did you really learn to shoot like that? Those weren't just lucky shots. Jamie's eyes tracked to the mountains, where storm clouds were gathering in earnest now. Ms. Chen, sometimes the best way to protect something isn't to hide your strengths. It's to make sure everyone knows exactly what they're dealing with. I spent 10 years competing at the highest levels of practical shooting, setting records that still stand. But I came back to Cedar Grove because I knew someday these mountains would need more than just a sheriff with a badge. They'd need someone who could remind people that mountain folk aren't to be trifled with. Jack Davidson, now being tended to by a paramedic, called out, "Tell them about Atlanta, Jamie. Tell them what they used to call you on the circuit." But Jamie was already walking away, heading back toward his office. The gathered crowd parted before him like water, whispers following in his wake. The Iron Wolves had just learned what competition shooters had known for years. Sometimes the deadliest force isn't the one that makes the most noise, but the one that strikes with quiet, unwavering precision. The storm was getting closer, but in Cedar Grove, they were starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, their young sheriff was storm enough. The aftermath of the shooting at Davidson spread through Cedar Grove like wildfire. By sunset, Sarah Chen's article had gone viral on local news sites, complete with cell phone footage of Jamie's impossible shots. The Iron Wolves' humiliation was public, dramatic, and precisely what Jamie had been counting on. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," Deputy Torres observed, dropping a fresh stack of reports on Jamie's desk. The sheriff's office hummed with unusual activity as phones rang constantly with calls from regional media outlets. "Our sources say Victor Rodriguez is on his way personally. Apparently, he was in Charleston when he got the news." Jamie studied the surveillance photos spread across his desk showing increased Iron Wolves activity along the county lines. Good. Let him come. Every move they make in anger is another mistake we can use. "That's what worries me," Torres replied, her earlier skepticism replaced by genuine concern. Those shots today, they weren't just good, they were impossible. I've been in law enforcement 15 years, trained with SWAT teams, and I've never seen anything like it. But Rodriguez isn't going to challenge you to a shooting competition. These people played dirty. Before Jamie could respond, Mark Sullivan burst into the office, his weathered face grave. "Sheriff, we've got trouble at the high school. 3 Iron Wolves bikes in the parking lot, and Principal Matthews just called in a bomb threat." Jamie was on his feet instantly, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. "Empty threat, they're trying to cause panic. Force an evacuation where they can grab someone. Torres, call in every available deputy. Sullivan, get me the school's blueprints. And somebody find Jack Davidson. I need to know if they got anything specific from his shop before we stopped them." The next hour was controlled chaos. As Jamie had predicted, the bomb threat was a diversion. What the Iron Wolves hadn't counted on was finding every approach to the school already covered by deputies positioned according to Jamie's instructions. Their attempt to snatch the Miller boy during evacuation was thwarted before it began. "They're getting desperate," Jamie observed, watching through binoculars as the frustrated bikers roared away from the school. "Making rookie mistakes. Rodriguez's top lieutenant just exposed himself for nothing." "About that," Sullivan said, joining him at the observation point they'd set up on the school's roof. "Found something interesting in the background checks. Rodriguez and his crew. They're not just criminals. 3 of them, including Rodriguez himself, were ex-military. Special forces." Jamie lowered the binoculars, his expression thoughtful. "That explains the tactics they've been using. The psychological warfare, the coordinated strikes. They're treating Cedar Grove like an insurgency operation, which means they'll hit back hard after today's embarrassment," Torres added. "Military guys don't like being shown up, especially not by a small-town sheriff." "No," Jamie agreed, a small smile playing on his lips. "But that's exactly why they'll make their biggest mistake yet. Because what they don't know is that while they were learning military tactics, I was perfecting something else entirely." He moved to the roof's edge, looking out over Cedar Grove. The afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and shadow, the kind of light that made long-distance shooting particularly challenging. In competition, there's a term called shooting under stress. They put you in impossible situations, physical exhaustion, awkward positions, complex target arrays. The winners aren't just good shots. They're problem solvers who can think clearly when everything's going wrong. "Like right now?" Sullivan asked dryly. "Exactly like right now. Rodriguez thinks his military training gives him the advantage, but he's about to learn that there's a big difference between combat shooting and what I do." Jamie checked his phone as it buzzed with a new message. "Jack Davidson's awake. Says they were specifically asking about ammunition supplies, distribution routes." Torres frowned. "They're planning something big, trying to cut off the town's access to ammunition before they make their real move." "No," Jamie corrected. "They're showing us exactly what they're afraid of. They know they can't match us shot for shot, so they're trying to change the game. Sullivan, get me everything you can on Rodriguez's military record. Torres, I need you to reach out to your contacts in Charleston. Find out exactly what happened in the other towns they took over." As his deputies moved to comply, Jamie remained at the roof's edge, watching storm clouds gather over the mountains. The wind carried the scent of rain and pine, reminding him of long days spent practicing in all weather conditions. Those countless hours of training hadn't just taught him how to shoot. They'd taught him how to think, how to read situations and opponents, how to turn their strengths into weaknesses. His radio crackled with an urgent message from the county line checkpoint. "Sheriff, we've got multiple Iron Wolves formations moving in from 3 directions, at least 20 bikes. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore." "Good," Jamie replied, his voice carrying the same calm certainty he'd used to win his last championship. "Tell our people to fall back. Make it look like they're caught off guard. Let them think their show of force is working." "Sheriff," Torres protested, "they're coming in force. This isn't like this morning. You can't outshoot an army." Jamie checked his weapon one final time, the familiar motion centering him. "I don't plan to. Rodriguez wants to play military commander? Fine. But he's about to learn something they taught me in my first competition. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to match force with force. It's to change the rules of engagement entirely. Thunder rolled through the mountains as Jamie descended from the roof, his steps measured and confident. Cedar Grove was about to become a battleground, but not the kind Rodriguez was expecting. The Iron Wolves were bringing an army to a precision contest, and they were about to learn why Jamie's competition nickname hadn't just been about his aim. It had been about his ability to see opportunities others missed. "Get everyone in position," he ordered as they reached ground level. "And somebody find me Sarah Chen. If Rodriguez wants to make a show of force, let's make sure everyone sees what happens next." It's time Cedar Grove understood exactly why I came home, and why sometimes the best defense isn't a badge or a gun. It's knowing how to turn your opponent's momentum against them. The storm was about to break over Cedar Grove, but Jamie Carson was ready. He'd spent his whole life preparing for a moment like this, though he hadn't known it then. The Iron Wolves were bringing thunder, but they were about to learn about lightning, swift, precise, and impossible to stop once it had chosen its target. The town hall meeting was packed, every seat filled and people standing along the walls of the old brick building. The afternoon storm had broken, leaving the air heavy with anticipation as Cedar Grove's residents gathered to face the growing crisis. Jamie Carson stood at the podium, his badge catching the light from the old chandelier as he surveyed the faces before him. Shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, all looking to their young sheriff for answers. 3 hours ago, Jamie began, his voice carrying to every corner. The Iron Wolves made their intentions clear. They think 20 bikes and some ex-military leadership are enough to break this town. They're wrong. Not because of my badge, and not because of my shooting skills, but because of something they don't understand about mountain communities. He moved to a large map pinned to the wall, marked with red dots showing every incident since the gang's arrival. Sarah Chen sat in the front row, her pen flying across her notepad, while Jack Davidson, his head still bandaged, watched with fierce pride from his seat near the emergency exit. "Sheriff," Martha Miller stood up, her voice trembling but determined. "They tried to take my Tommy today, at his school. His school. How are we supposed to feel safe when they're targeting our children?" "Good," Jamie replied, his voice carrying the same calm certainty he'd used to win his last championship. "Tell our people to fall back. Make it look like they're caught off guard. Let them think their show of force is working." "Sheriff," Torres protested, "they're coming in force. This isn't like this morning. You can't outshoot an army." Jamie checked his weapon one final time, the familiar motion centering him. "I don't plan to. Rodriguez wants to play military commander? Fine. But he's about to learn something they taught me in my first competition. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to match force with force. It's to change the rules of engagement entirely." Thunder rolled through the mountains as Jamie descended from the roof, his steps measured and confident. Cedar Grove was about to become a battleground, but not the kind Rodriguez was expecting. The Iron Wolves were bringing an army to a precision contest, and they were about to learn why Jamie's competition nickname hadn't just been about his aim. It had been about his ability to see opportunities others missed. "Get everyone in position," he ordered as they reached ground level. "And somebody find me Sarah Chen. If Rodriguez wants to make a show of force, let's make sure everyone sees what happens next." It's time Cedar Grove understood exactly why I came home, and why sometimes the best defense isn't a badge or a gun. It's knowing how to turn your opponent's momentum against them. The storm was about to break over Cedar Grove, but Jamie Carson was ready. He'd spent his whole life preparing for a moment like this, though he hadn't known it then. The Iron Wolves were bringing thunder, but they were about to learn about lightning, swift, precise, and impossible to stop once it had chosen its target. The town hall meeting was packed, every seat filled and people standing along the walls of the old brick building. The afternoon storm had broken, leaving the air heavy with anticipation as Cedar Grove's residents gathered to face the growing crisis. Jamie Carson stood at the podium, his badge catching the light from the old chandelier as he surveyed the faces before him. Shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, all looking to their young sheriff for answers. 3 hours ago, Jamie began, his voice carrying to every corner. The Iron Wolves made their intentions clear. They think 20 bikes and some ex-military leadership are enough to break this town. They're wrong. Not because of my badge, and not because of my shooting skills, but because of something they don't understand about mountain communities. He moved to a large map pinned to the wall, marked with red dots showing every incident since the gang's arrival. Sarah Chen sat in the front row, her pen flying across her notepad, while Jack Davidson, his head still bandaged, watched with fierce pride from his seat near the emergency exit. "Sheriff!" Martha Miller stood up, her voice trembling but determined. "They tried to take my Tommy today, at his school. His school. How are we supposed to feel safe when they're targeting our children?" Jamie's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Mrs. Miller, that attempt failed for a reason. Not because I outshot them this morning, but because we were ready. Because Officer Wilson's daughter, who works in the school office, noticed those bikes circling yesterday. Because Coach Thompson, who served 20 years in the Marines, recognized their patrol patterns. Because this community doesn't just live here. It watches, it notices, it protects its own." Deputy Torres stepped forward, distributing documents to the town council. "The Iron Wolves aren't just a gang," she explained, her earlier skepticism of Jamie now replaced by professional respect. "They're a paramilitary organization. Victor Rodriguez, their leader, served in special forces. They've been using military-grade tactics to terrorize small towns up and down the Appalachian corridor. Which means they're predictable," Jamie added, clicking through a series of surveillance photos on the projector. "Military tactics work on military targets, but they've never faced a community defended by someone who specialized in solving problems that don't have standard solutions." Bill O'Malley stood up, his baker's apron still dusted with flour. "That shooting this morning, those weren't just lucky shots, were they, Sheriff?" Mike Kelly showed me the video. 3 guns, 3 shots, faster than I could blink. Jamie's hand unconsciously touched his holster, the familiar motion centering him. "No, Mr. O'Malley. They weren't lucky. What you saw was the result of 10 years of competitive shooting at the highest levels. But here's what matters. Those shots weren't just about accuracy. They were about sending a message." He clicked to the next slide, showing Iron Wolves gathering at the county lines. "Rodriguez is coming because he has to. His whole operation depends on fear, on making communities believe they're helpless. This morning didn't just embarrass him. It showed every town they've terrorized that they're not invincible." Judge Harrison's voice cut through the murmurs. "That's why you came back, isn't it? You could have gone professional, made a career in competition shooting. Instead, you came back to Cedar Grove and took a job most people thought you were too young for." "Because I saw what was coming," Jamie confirmed. 2 years ago, at my last competition, I met a shooter from West Virginia. He told me about a town called Millbrook, about how a paramilitary gang had taken control, how they were moving through the mountains like a cancer. I knew it was only a matter of time before they reached Cedar Grove. Sarah Chen's hand shot up. "So, you've been preparing for this? All those changes to the department's training programs, the surveillance equipment upgrades. Every competition I ever won taught me the same lesson," Jamie replied. "Victory doesn't go to the person with the fastest draw or the most accurate shot. It goes to the one who sees the whole course, who plans 3 stages ahead, who turns obstacles into advantages." He moved to the town hall's window, watching the mountain sunset paint the clouds in shades of purple and gold. Rodriguez thinks he's bringing an army to intimidate a small town. Instead, he's walking into a situation where every shopkeeper, every farmer, every high school kid with a cell phone is part of our intelligence network. Where every bridge and back road has cameras his military training won't expect. Where the community he's trying to terrorize is already 10 steps ahead of him. Mark Sullivan entered hurriedly, passing Jamie a note. The young sheriff read it, a small smile playing on his lips. "They're moving into position now. 23 bikes, split into 3 groups, using standard military convoy formations. Just like we expected." "What do we do?" someone called from the back. "We show them what they're really up against," Jamie answered. "Mrs. Miller, your diner's always been neutral, right? The place where everyone, even out-of-towners, feels welcome?" Linda nodded, confusion clear on her face. "How would you feel about hosting a town fair this weekend? The kind of event that draws everyone out, that shows Cedar Grove isn't afraid?" The confusion in the room gave way to understanding as Jamie outlined his plan. Every vendor would be an off-duty officer or former military member. Every food truck would house surveillance equipment. Every cheerful banner and string of lights would help funnel the Iron Wolves exactly where Jamie wanted them. "They're expecting us to hide," Jamie concluded, "to board up our windows and lock our doors. Instead, we're going to show them something they've never seen before. A community that stands together, that refuses to be intimidated, and that knows exactly how to turn their own tactics against them." Thunder rolled in the distance as the meeting continued, plans being made, roles assigned. Jamie watched his town come together, seeing in their faces the same determination he'd once felt on the competition range. The Iron Wolves were about to learn that they hadn't just picked a fight with a sharpshooting sheriff. They'd challenged a community that had been preparing for this moment longer than they knew. Outside, the storm clouds were gathering again, but this time they felt less like a warning and more like a promise. Cedar Grove was about to show Victor Rodriguez and his Iron Wolves that sometimes the most dangerous force isn't the one that comes roaring in on motorcycles. It's the one that's been quietly preparing, watching, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The week before, the town fair passed like a slow-motion game of chess. Jamie watched from his office window as Linda Miller's staff hung colorful banners across Main Street, their cheerful messages masking the careful strategy beneath. His desk was covered with surveillance photos, incident reports, and a detailed map of the fairground layout marked with precise measurements and firing angles. "Iron Wolves spotted at the county line," Deputy Torres reported, entering with fresh intelligence. 8 bikes, including Rodriguez and his top lieutenants. Victor the Vice himself is leading them. Former Green Beret, according to his service record. "Looking like your prediction about their response is dead on, Sheriff." Jamie nodded, checking his competition-grade Remington 1911 for the 100th time that morning. The familiar weight offered small comfort as he marked another position on the map. "And our backup units?" State police are positioned at all approach routes disguised as road maintenance crews. FBI tactical team is standing by 20 minutes out. Undercover officers are setting up their vendor booths now. She paused, studying him. "You really think Rodriguez will make his move here? At a town fair?" "He doesn't have a choice," Jamie replied, marking another strategic point on the map. This morning's show of force failed. His reputation's taking hits after the Davidson incident. He needs to make a statement, show everyone that Cedar Grove isn't really as strong as we appear. He tapped the map where X's marked sniper positions. More importantly, his military training will tell him this is his best opportunity. Lots of civilians, open spaces, multiple approach routes. Sullivan entered, his weathered face grave. "Just got word from our informant inside the gang. Rodriguez has been promising his supporters a show of force like nothing we've seen. But here's the concerning part. They've been asking around about high explosives." Jamie's jaw tightened. He'd anticipated violence, but this raised the stakes considerably. They're not just planning a confrontation. Rodriguez wants to make a statement, something public that shows every town in the region what happens when they resist. Linda burst in, her usual calm shattered. "Sheriff, 2 of Rodriguez's men just left the diner. They were talking about making sure tomorrow's fair is one nobody will forget. They didn't know Tommy was in the back, heard everything. They're planning something big at the bandstand." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Jamie said, pulling out the architectural plans of the fairground. "Linda, remember how we reinforced your diner's basement last week? We didn't just do that for storage." He turned to his team, energy radiating from his lean frame. "Rodriguez thinks he's planning a dramatic takedown. What he doesn't know is that every step he takes brings him closer to a trap 6 months in the making." Officer Jake Wilson appeared, carrying cases of communication equipment. "Surveillance systems are in place, Sheriff. Every vendor booth has cameras with thermal imaging. Motion sensors cover all blind spots. If anyone so much as sneezes wrong tomorrow, we'll know about it." Jamie moved to the evidence wall where photos tracked the Iron Wolves' activities since their arrival. Tomorrow isn't just about stopping a gang. It's about showing Cedar Grove and every town like it that you don't need an army to stand against intimidation. Sometimes all you need is a community willing to stand together and a sheriff crazy enough to use a town fair as bait, Torres finished, but there was respect in her voice now. They call me Eagle Eye like it's a joke, Jamie said quietly, checking his backup weapon. By tomorrow night, they'll understand why that name used to make other competitive shooters forfeit matches rather than face me on the range. But more importantly, they'll learn why you don't threaten a mountain community that's been preparing for you longer than you know. The team dispersed to final preparations, each member knowing their role in the complex plan. Jamie remained at the window, watching storm clouds gather over Cedar Grove. Tomorrow would test not just his skills with a gun, but everything he believed about community, justice, and the kind of courage it takes to stand against those who rule through fear. One more thing, he called out as his deputies reached the door. Rodriguez's military background gives him one critical weakness. He thinks in terms of traditional tactics, flanking movements, shows of force, shock, and awe. But I spent 10 years learning how to solve problems that don't have standard solutions. Tomorrow, we're not just going to beat them, we're going to shatter every assumption they've made about what they're facing. He spread out the final set of photos, showing the Iron Wolves' leadership structure. Look here, Rodriguez, former Special Forces. His lieutenant, Jackson, Force Recon. Phillips, Army Rangers. All of them used to operate with strict protocols, defined rules of engagement. But competitive shooting taught me something they never learned in the military. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to play by anyone's rules. It's to change the game entirely. The plan was intricate, each element carefully designed to appear random while serving a specific purpose. The cotton candy stand that would give them elevation for surveillance. The ring toss game is positioned to funnel foot traffic in predictable patterns. Even the seemingly chaotic placement of food trucks created natural choke points and clear fields of fire. Sheriff, Torres asked, pausing at the door. What if Rodriguez figures it out? He's not stupid. He managed to take over 3 other towns. Jamie's hand moved to his holster, the gesture now more habit than conscious thought. That's exactly what I'm counting on. He's smart enough to spot a standard trap, which is why this isn't one. Everything he sees tomorrow will look exactly like what he expects. A small town trying to pretend everything's normal. His training will tell him it's the perfect opportunity to strike. What he won't realize until it's too late is that every single element of his perfect opportunity has been precisely calculated, measured, and prepared for. Thunder rolled across the mountains as the team made their final preparations. In Cedar Grove, storms had always been taken as omens. Tomorrow, the Iron Wolves would learn why mountain folk had survived in these hills for generations. Not just because they were tough, but because they knew how to turn nature itself into an ally. Jamie checked his weapon one final time. Muscle memory from thousands of competition draws making the motion fluid, automatic. Tomorrow, Victor Rodriguez would learn the difference between military precision and competition accuracy, between forcing submission and earning respect, between threatening a town and challenging a community that had turned preparation into an art form. The storm was coming to Cedar Grove, but this time it wasn't riding in on motorcycles. It was already here, waiting in the steady hands of a sheriff who had spent his whole life preparing for a moment exactly like this. The night before the fair, Jamie found himself in his father's old study, now thick with dust and memories. The trophy cabinet in the corner held more than just his shooting awards. It contained the real reason he'd come back to Cedar Grove, the truth he hadn't shared at the town meeting. Thought I might find you here. Judge Harrison's voice came from the doorway. The old judge entered slowly, his eyes taking in the familiar room. Your father used to spend nights like this in here too, planning how to keep the town safe. Jamie's hand rested on an old photograph showing his father in his own sheriff's uniform, standing proud beside a much younger Harrison. Did you know? He asked quietly. When you supported my appointment, did you know what was really happening with the Iron Wolves? The judge settled into the worn leather chair by the window, lightning from the approaching storm briefly illuminating his grave expression. I knew enough, known about them since before your father died. They weren't called the Iron Wolves then, but they were the same organization. Different name, same tactics. Jamie's head snapped up. What are you saying? 3 years ago when your father was investigating those mysterious accidents at the old mining roads, it wasn't just about unsafe conditions, was it? Torres stood in the doorway, case files in hand. I've been digging, Sheriff. Those accidents were the Iron Wolves' first attempt to move into Cedar Grove. Only back then, they called themselves the Mountain Kings. Jamie's jaw tightened as he opened the bottom drawer of his father's desk, pulling out a worn leather notebook. Dad was closing in on them. He'd traced their operation back to someone high up in the state government, someone who was using gangs like the Mountain Kings to pressure small towns into accepting state control of local law enforcement. The night of the crash, Harrison added softly, John called me. Said he had proof. Was going to expose the whole operation. Next morning, they found his patrol car at the bottom of Miller's Gorge. Everyone called it an accident. Dark night, bad roads, storm conditions. Everyone except you, Torres said, understanding dawning in her eyes. That's why you spent those years away, wasn't it? The competitions, the training. It wasn't just about shooting. Jamie opened his father's notebook, revealing pages of detailed notes, surveillance photos, connection maps. I knew I couldn't just come back with a badge and a gun. Dad tried that approach, and they killed him for it. I needed something more. Needed to become someone they wouldn't expect, someone who could turn their own tactics against them. Lightning flashed again, followed almost immediately by thunder. The storm was nearly overhead now. Rodriguez isn't just here because we embarrassed his gang, Jamie continued. He's here because someone higher up is worried. They recognized my name when I was appointed and knew I was John Carson's son. They're afraid I found my father's evidence, did you? Harrison leaned forward, his voice urgent. Better. Jamie moved to the trophy cabinet, reaching behind his first championship plaque to remove a hidden flash drive. Dad may have gathered the evidence, but I spent 3 years building a case they can't bury. Every competition I entered, every title I won, they were just cover, letting me travel to other towns, gather testimony from other victims, track money trails and connections. Torres picked up one of the files, eyes widening as she read. These go all the way to the state capitol. Commissioner Bradford, the same man who's been pushing for emergency powers over local law enforcement, the same man who was spotted meeting with the Mountain King's leadership 3 days before my father's death, Jamie finished. Rodriguez doesn't know it, but when he shows up tomorrow, he's not just walking into a tactical trap. He's walking into the final piece of evidence we need, the connection that ties everything together. A new figure appeared in the doorway. Sarah Chen, notepad in hand. That's why you let me keep reporting on everything, isn't it? You weren't just trying to send a message to the Iron Wolves. You were building a public record. Jamie nodded. Dad's biggest mistake was working alone, keeping his evidence secret until he could expose everything at once. I learned from that. Everything that's happened since the Iron Wolves arrived. Every incident, every response, every connection. It's all been documented, publicized, impossible to sweep under the rug. But tomorrow, Harrison said gravely, Rodriguez will come with force. He's military trained, desperate, and he's got nothing left to lose. Good. Jamie checked his competition pistol one final time, the motion as natural as breathing. Because what he doesn't know is that every shot I took in competition, every title I won, every record I set, they weren't just about winning trophies. They were about preparing for one specific moment. The moment I get to look the man who ordered my father's death in the eye and show him exactly why they used to call me Eagle Eye. Thunder crashed overhead as Jamie laid out the final pieces of his plan. The town fair wasn't just a trap for the Iron Wolves. It was the culmination of a 3-year operation to expose corruption that reached to the highest levels of state government. Each carefully placed vendor, every strategic camera position, all the seemingly innocent preparations weren't just about protecting Cedar Grove. They were about ensuring that when the truth finally came out, no amount of political power could bury it. Dad died trying to protect this town, Jamie said quietly, looking at the old photograph one last time. Tomorrow, we will finish what he started, but we do it my way, with precision, patience, and the kind of accuracy that only comes from knowing exactly what you're aiming at. The storm raged outside, but in the quiet of his father's study, Jamie Carson felt nothing but calm. Tomorrow wasn't just about stopping a gang or saving a town. It was about justice served cold and precise, with the kind of accuracy that only comes from spending years preparing for a single, perfect shot. The morning of the fair dawned bright and clear, the previous night's storm leaving the air crisp and clean. Jamie stood in the command center they'd established in Linda's reinforced basement, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from every camera positioned around the fairgrounds. The smell of fresh coffee and baking pies drifted down from the diner above, a surreal contrast to the tension humming through the law enforcement network. First Iron Wolves spotted, Torres reported through the secure radio channel. Rodriguez's advance team 8 bikes. They're splitting up, taking positions around the perimeter, just like you predicted. Jamie watched the thermal imaging screens, tracking the bikers' movements with the same precision he'd once used to track moving targets in competition. Each rider's position was exactly where he'd expected them to be, Rodriguez's military training making them predictably unpredictable. Main group approaching from the south, Sullivan's voice crackled through the radio. Looks like Rodriguez brought his entire crew, counting at least 15 bikes all armed. Jesus, Sheriff, they're not even trying to hide it anymore. They don't think they need to, Jamie replied, his voice steady. Keep your positions. Remember, we need them all in place before we move. He turned to Linda, who was coordinating the civilian side of their operation. How's the crowd control going? Reverend Parker's youth group is doing a great job keeping families in the designated safe zones, Linda reported. Nobody suspects a thing. Even got some of Rodriguez's men buying cotton candy. Jamie checked his weapon one final time, the familiar motion centering him. Years of competitive shooting had taught him that the moment before action was often more dangerous than the action itself. That's when mistakes happened. Movement at the bandstand, Wilson called out urgently. Rodriguez's men are unloading something from their saddlebags. Thermal imaging showing. Sheriff, those look like explosive components. Right on schedule, Jamie replied, his voice deadly calm. Torres confirmed Rodriguez's location. He just passed the cotton candy stand heading straight for the bandstand. Got at least 12 riders with him, all heavily armed. Wait, getting movement from the north entrance too. More bikes coming in. Jamie stood, adjusting his tactical vest beneath his uniform shirt. All units, execute Phase 1. Martinez, start the music. The opening chords of a country song blasted through the fair speakers, masking the sound of tactical teams moving into position. Through the monitors, Jamie watched as Victor Rodriguez confronted his advance team near the bandstand, their body language screaming hostility even without audio. They're arguing, Torres reported. Rodriguez just shoved his lieutenant. Multiple weapons spotted. I count at least 8 wolves reaching for guns. Wait for my mark, Jamie commanded, already moving up the basement stairs. Remember, we need to contain this before any civilians are at risk. He emerged into the sunlight just as the first shot rang out. The crack of gunfire cut through the music, followed by screams as fairgoers began running. But thanks to their preparation, the evacuation routes were clear, volunteer teams calmly guiding people to safety. Sheriff, Rodriguez's voice boomed across the fairground. You wanted to see real power? Watch what happens to towns that don't learn their place. He held up what looked like a detonator, his scarred face twisted in a sneer. Jamie stepped into the open, his stance relaxed but ready. Years of competition had taught him that tension was the enemy of speed. Victor, he called out, I was hoping we could do this the easy way. The easy way? Rodriguez laughed, showing the detonator. Like how you played us thinking we wouldn't figure out your little trap? Oh, I was counting on you figuring it out, Jamie replied, his voice carrying across the now empty fairground. Just like I was counting on you bringing those explosives, the ones you bought from a supplier who works for us. Rodriguez's face contorted with rage and disbelief. He squeezed the detonator, but nothing happened. In that moment of confusion, Jamie moved. Later, witnesses would say it was like watching a lightning strike. One moment the sheriff was standing still, the next his gun had cleared leather and fired 3 times with impossible precision. The detonator shattered in Rodriguez's hand. His backup weapon went spinning away before he could even grip it, and the rifle of his nearest lieutenant clattered to the ground, its action housing surgically destroyed by a single shot. "That's 3, Jamie announced into stunned silence. "Want to try for 4? Because I've got 14 more rounds, and unlike your military training, my kind of accuracy doesn't need a second chance." Rodriguez stared at his bleeding hand where detonator fragments had cut him. Around the fairground, iron wolves stood frozen, weapons half drawn as they processed what they'd just witnessed. "Those weren't just warning shots," Jamie continued, his aim never wavering. "That was me demonstrating the difference between military marksmanship and competition precision. Now we can do this the hard way, in which case you'll all learn exactly why they used to call me Eagle Eye on the pro circuit. Or you can surrender and maybe live long enough to testify about who really gave the order to kill John Carson 3 years ago." Rodriguez's head snapped up at that, genuine fear flickering across his face for the first time. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Jamie's voice carried an edge now. "Commissioner Bradford's getting nervous, isn't he? That's why he sent you here. Not just to take over another town, but to silence John Carson's son before he could finish what his father started." Thunder rolled in the distance as Jamie took another step forward, his movement deliberate and controlled. "But here's what Bradford never understood. Dad was a good sheriff, but he worked alone. Me? I spent 3 years building a network, gathering evidence, preparing for this exact moment. Every shot I took in competition was practice for today. Every record I set was a message to people like you that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the one that makes the most noise." Rodriguez's hand twitched toward his backup piece. Jamie's response was pure reflex, muscle memory from thousands of hours on the range. 2 more shots rang out in rapid succession, sending Rodriguez's hidden weapon flying and neatly disarming his closest supporter. "That's 5 shots," Jamie said calmly. "Still 10 left in the magazine, and I haven't even started showing off yet. So what's it going to be, Victor? Want to see why my competition records still stand? Or are you ready to talk about the night John Carson's brake lines were cut?" The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Around the fairground, iron wolves looked to their leader, waiting to see if this was the moment they'd finally met, a force they couldn't intimidate or overwhelm. Thunder rolled again, closer now, as Cedar Grove held its breath, waiting to see if Victor Rodriguez would learn from his mistakes or force Jamie Carson to demonstrate exactly why they'd called him Eagle. Rodriguez's face had gone from shocked to calculating, a dangerous smile spreading across his scarred features. "You know, Sheriff," he called out, his voice carrying across the silent fairground, "you're not the only one who's been planning for this moment. Bradford said you might be trouble, just like your old man. That's why we brought insurance." A new engine sound cut through the tension, not motorcycles this time, but the heavy rumble of diesel engines. 3 black SUVs rolled into view, their tinted windows and government plates telling their own story. "State Police Special Response Team," Torres reported through Jamie's earpiece, her voice tense. "But something's not right. Their tactical gear isn't standard issue." "Because they're not real state police," Jamie replied quietly, his mind racing through calculations like he was facing a particularly complex shooting stage. "Bradford's private security team. Ex-military contractors." Rodriguez's smile widened. "Smart boy. You see, while you were setting up your cute little trap with cameras and small-town deputies, we were putting together something a bit more professional. Bradford sends his regards, by the way. Says you're just as stubborn as your father was, right up until that last drive down Miller's Gorge." The SUV doors opened in perfect synchronization, disgorging men in tactical gear that looked official enough to fool casual observers. Jamie counted 12 operators, their movements showing the kind of precision that only comes from years of private military work. "Sheriff Carson," a new voice called out. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped from the lead vehicle, Thomas Bradford himself, the state commissioner who'd been pushing for emergency powers over local law enforcement. "I'd hoped to handle this more discreetly, but you forced my hand just like your father did." Jamie's aim remained steady, his competition-trained eyes noting every detail. Bradford's security team was spreading out in a standard containment formation, but they were making one critical mistake. They were treating this like a military operation. "Quite a show of force, Commissioner," Jamie replied, his voice carrying the same calm certainty he'd used to win his last championship. "But you might want to tell your men to check their backgrounds more carefully. See those carnival booths they're using for cover? Each one's been reinforced with level 3 ballistic panels. And those innocent food trucks? They're all staffed by FBI tactical teams." Bradford's confident smile flickered. "You're bluffing. The FBI has no jurisdiction here." "Don't I?" Jamie took a single step forward, noting how Bradford's security team tensed. 3 years ago, Dad thought he had to handle everything alone. That's why you were able to make his death look like an accident. But me? I spent those years building something you can't stop. A case file that's already been distributed to every major law enforcement agency and news outlet in the region. Rodriguez shifted uneasily, looking between Bradford and Jamie. "You said this would be simple," he growled at the commissioner. "Take control of another small town. Make an example." "Shut up," Bradford snapped, but the damage was done. Jamie allowed himself a small smile as he saw Sarah Chen's camera, capturing every word from her hidden position. "That's the thing about corruption," Jamie continued, his voice pitched to carry to Chen's microphone. "It only works in the shadows. Dad had evidence of your scheme, using gangs like the Iron Wolves to terrorize small towns, creating the very crisis you needed to justify your emergency powers bill. But he kept that evidence to himself, thinking he could expose everything at once. I learned from his mistake." Thunder rolled overhead as Bradford's face darkened with rage. "You think you're clever, boy? You think some hidden cameras and out-of-town FBI agents can stop what's coming? I own half the state legislature. By this time tomorrow, the emergency powers bill will pass and every small-town sheriff who thinks they can stand against progress will learn their place." "Progress?" Jamie's laugh was sharp. "Is that what you call sending thugs to threaten children? Using gangs to terrorize communities? Murdering honest lawmen who get too close to the truth?" Bradford's hand slashed through the air. "Enough. Take him down. Now." The private security team moved with professional precision, weapons raising in perfect coordination. But Jamie had spent years preparing for this moment, and he'd learned something on the competition circuit that these military-trained operators had never understood. Sometimes the best defense isn't speed or force, but knowing exactly where to place your shots. 3 rapid-fire shots rang out, each finding its mark with surgical precision. The tactical lights mounted on the lead operator's weapons shattered, plunging their section of the fairground into shadow. 2 more shots disabled the radio equipment of Bradford's command team. "That's 8 shots," Jamie announced calmly. "Want to see what I can do with the rest of this magazine? Or should we talk about those documents Dad collected? The ones showing how you've been funneling state emergency funds through shell companies to finance your private army?" "You're outnumbered," Bradford snarled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Even you can't outshoot all of us." "I don't have to." Jamie's smile was cold as winter in the mountains. "Because while you were focused on all this tactical theatrics, you forgot something important about small towns. We look out for our own." As if on cue, the carnival rides powered down, plunging half the fairground into darkness. The speakers that had been playing country music switched to emergency broadcast tones, disorienting Bradford's team. And from every direction came the sound of weapons being readied as Cedar Grove's citizens, deputies, veterans, hunters, and everyday townspeople emerged from their hiding spots. "See, that's the difference between your kind of power and ours," Jamie continued, his aim never wavering from Bradford. "You think it's all about force, about having the most guns or the biggest threats, but real power? That comes from the community. From people willing to stand together against men like you who think they can buy and bully their way to control." The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, fat raindrops beginning to fall as Bradford looked around, realizing that his carefully planned operation had just become a trap, Not just for the Iron Wolves, but for him and everything he represented. "Last chance, Commissioner," Jamie announced, his voice carrying over the growing storm. "Surrender now, or find out why they used to call me Eagle Eye. Your choice." Bradford's calculated facade cracked, revealing the rage beneath. "You think this is some kind of shooting competition, boy? This is real power. This is—" The crack of a single shot cut through his words. Jamie's bullet sliced through the air with competition-grade precision, cutting the radio antenna off Bradford's command vehicle. "That's 9, Jamie announced calmly. "And that shot? That was just to remind you what real accuracy looks like. The kind that comes from spending 10,000 hours perfecting one single skill." His eyes never left Bradford as he continued. "The kind of accuracy that could have put a bullet through your engine block 3 seconds after you arrived, or taken out your tactical team's weapons before they cleared their holsters." Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the scene in stark relief. Bradford's private army frozen in their positions, the Iron Wolves looking increasingly uncertain, and Cedar Grove's citizens standing firm behind their sheriff. "You want to talk about real power?" Jamie's voice carried across the fairground. "Let's talk about how you've been using the Iron Wolves. How many other sheriffs have you murdered, Commissioner? How many other towns have you terrorized into submission? Dad found out about 3 before you killed him. I've documented 12. Sarah Chen's voice rang out from her hidden position. "And I've verified every single one." The reporter stood, her camera still rolling, digital recorder held high. "Every conversation since you arrived has been recorded, Commissioner, including your admission about the Emergency Powers Bill." Bradford's composure shattered completely. "Kill them. Kill them all." But before his men could react, a new sound cut through the tension. Police sirens, dozens of them, approaching from every direction. Red and blue lights began reflecting off the rain-slicked streets. "That would be the state police," Jamie said. "The real ones this time, along with FBI tactical teams from 3 states. Turns out when you're planning to expose corruption at the highest levels of state government, it helps to have friends in high places." Rodriguez, who had been watching the exchange with growing unease, suddenly made his move. His hand flashed toward a hidden weapon, but Jamie was faster. Years of competition-honed reflexes making the difference. 2 shots rang out in rapid succession. The first knocked Rodriguez's backup piece away before he could grip it. The second shot, fired in the same fluid motion, disabled the Iron Wolves leader's motorcycle ignition. "That's 11, Jamie counted calmly. "Still got 4 rounds left, Commissioner. Want to see what I can do with them? Or should we talk about those offshore accounts where you've been hiding the money from your emergency management contracts?" Bradford's security team began to waver, their professional discipline cracking as they realized the depth of the trap they'd walked into. Through his earpiece, Jamie could hear Torres coordinating with the incoming law enforcement units. "You don't understand what you're doing," Bradford snarled, desperation creeping into his voice. "This isn't about just one county. The Emergency Powers Bill is just the beginning. We're bringing order to these backwater towns, dragging them into the modern age whether they like it or not." "Order?" Jamie's laugh was sharp as a gunshot. "Is that what you call it? Using corrupt officials and hired thugs to terrorize small towns until they beg for state intervention? Creating the very problems you promised to solve?" Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the ground. In that brilliant moment of illumination, Jamie saw Bradford's hand move toward his own concealed weapon. The next 3 shots happened so fast they seemed simultaneous. Bradford's hidden gun went spinning away, his backup piece in his ankle holster was shattered, and the dashboard of his command vehicle erupted in sparks as its communication system was destroyed. "That's 14, Jamie announced. 1 round left, Commissioner. Care to guess where this one's going if you so much as twitch?" The sound of approaching sirens grew louder. Bradford's tactical team looked to their boss, then at the growing law enforcement presence surrounding the fairground. One by one, they began lowering their weapons. "You know what your biggest mistake was?" Jamie asked, his voice carrying clearly through the rain. You thought small towns were weak, easy targets. You never understood that places like Cedar Grove survive because we stand together. Every person here knows every other. We look out for our own. As if to prove his point, Linda Miller's voice rang out from the diner. Got the whole thing on our security cameras, Sheriff. Every word, every thread, all backed up to 3 different servers. And I've got the money trail. Judge Harrison emerged from his position, holding up a thick file. Every transaction, every shell company, every bribe. 3 years of evidence gathered by John Carson and completed by his son. Bradford's face had gone ashen. This is impossible. You're just a small-town sheriff, a competition shooter playing cop. That's right, Jamie agreed. I am a competition shooter, which means I spent years learning how to solve problems under pressure, how to think 3 steps ahead, how to turn every obstacle into an advantage. His aim remained rock steady despite the rain. But more importantly, I'm John Carson's son, and he taught me that real justice isn't about who has the most power. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. The storm broke overhead in earnest now, rain pouring down as FBI vehicles began rolling into the fairground. Bradford looked around wildly, seeing his carefully constructed power structure crumbling before his eyes. One last round, Jamie reminded him softly. One last chance to decide how this ends, because whatever happens next, Cedar Grove just showed every small town in America something important, that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't a gun or a badge or even political power. Sometimes it's the quiet determination of people who've had enough of being bullied and are ready to stand together against corruption. Thunder crashed overhead, but in Cedar Grove, they were starting to recognize it not as nature's fury, but as applause for community that had refused to be broken. Bradford's composure finally shattered completely. With a roar of rage that cut through the storm, he grabbed one of his private security team's weapons and opened fire. The sound of automatic gunfire filled the air, but Jamie had already moved, his competition-trained reflexes carrying him to cover behind a reinforced carnival booth. "Hold your positions," Jamie commanded through his radio, as Bradford's men began firing wildly. "Let them waste their ammunition. Every shot they fire is more evidence against them." Through the chaos, Jamie's trained eye noticed something crucial. Bradford wasn't shooting to kill. He was creating cover fire, trying to clear a path to his command vehicle. The commissioner was running. "He's going for the SUV," Torres called out over the radio. "Got documents in there, probably evidence he can't afford to lose." Jamie's mind raced through calculations like he was facing the most complex shooting stage of his career. Time seemed to slow as he analyzed angles, trajectories, and risk factors. Bradford's security team had created a wall of suppressing fire, making any direct shot impossible. But Jamie hadn't won all those competitions by taking direct shots. "Linda," he called through his radio. "Remember that trick shot that won me the state championship? The one with the mirror?" "The banner," Linda's voice crackled back. "The metal banner frame above the bandstand? It's got the same angle." Jamie allowed himself a small smile. In his last competition, he'd won by bouncing a shot off a steel target to hit a hidden objective. Now, in the rain-slicked chaos of the fairground, he was about to attempt something similar, but with much higher stakes. "All units," he commanded. "When I take this shot, execute Containment Plan Delta." Bradford's men are professionals. Once their commander is down, they'll follow protocol and surrender. Drawing on every hour of practice, every competition lesson, every moment that had led to this, Jamie stepped out from cover. His final round, the last bullet in his magazine, had to count. Time seemed to crystallize as he sighted along his barrel, doing complex geometric calculations in his head while factoring in wind, rain, and the angle of the metal banner frame. Bradford had almost reached his vehicle, documents clutched in his free hand. "You're just like your father," he screamed over the storm. "Too stubborn to know when you're beaten." "No," Jamie replied calmly. "I'm the one who learned from his mistakes." The shot, when it came, seemed to bend reality. The bullet struck the metal banner frame at precisely the calculated angle, ricocheting downward. Bradford's eyes widened as the round struck his weapon's receiver, destroying the firing mechanism and sending the gun spinning from his grasp. The documents he'd been clutching scattered in the wind. "That's 15, Jamie announced into the sudden silence. "Magazine's empty now, Commissioner." "But I don't need any more rounds. You've lost." As if choreographed, FBI tactical teams emerged from their hiding spots in the food trucks. State police vehicles rolled in from every direction, their lights painting the rain-soaked fairground in red and blue. Bradford's private security team, seeing their commander disarmed and their operation exposed, began lowering their weapons. Rodriguez and his iron wolves, forgotten in the chaos, tried to make a break for their bikes. They found Sarah Chen waiting with her camera, backed by a group of Cedar Grove's veterans who'd taken up strategic positions around the motorcycle parking area. "Nobody's running this time," Jamie called out. "Not the Iron Wolves, not Bradford's mercenaries, and especially not the man who ordered my father's murder." Bradford, his expensive suit soaked through, looked around wildly as his world collapsed. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "The emergency powers bill. It wasn't just about control. The development contracts alone were worth billions. We were going to reshape these mountains, bring progress." "Progress?" Jamie's voice cut through the rain. "You mean like the progress you brought to Millbrook? To Riverdale? To every other town where good people died because they stood up to your corruption?" The FBI tactical team reached Bradford, taking him into custody as Judge Harrison emerged from the diner's basement command center, holding up a laptop. "Just received confirmation. Every second of this has been streaming live to news outlets across 3 states. The evidence is out, Commissioner. All of it." Jamie finally lowered his weapon, watching as Torres and Sullivan began coordinating with the FBI to process the scenes. Around them, Cedar Grove's citizens emerged from their positions, gathering in the rain-soaked fairground to witness the end of Bradford's reign of terror. "Sheriff," Rodriguez called out as he was being cuffed. "Those shots, the one at Davidson's shop, the detonator, that last ricochet, nobody's that good. Nobody can shoot like that." Jamie turned to the fallen gang leader. "That's because you never understood what you were really facing. You thought this was about guns and power. But every shot I took today was backed by something stronger than accuracy. It was backed by justice, by community, and by the kind of patience that comes from spending years preparing for one perfect moment." Linda approached, Tommy clutching her hand. "Is it really over, Sheriff?" "Are we safe now?" Jamie looked at the boy, remembering how his own father had once stood against corruption to keep Cedar Grove safe. "It's over, Tommy. And you know what? Your generation won't have to worry about men like Bradford using gangs like the Iron Wolves to terrorize small towns. Because today, we showed everyone watching that when communities stand together, when good people refuse to be intimidated, no amount of political power or hired guns can break them." Thunder rolled one last time across the mountains, but it sounded different now. Less like nature's fury and more like applause for a community that had stood its ground. Bradford's corruption had brought storm clouds to Cedar Grove, but in the end, it wasn't the sheriff's legendary accuracy that had won the day. It was the unshakable spirit of mountain folk who'd proven that sometimes the strongest force isn't the one that comes roaring in with guns and threats. It's the quiet determination of people protecting their home and their way of life. Sarah Chen approached, her camera still recording. "Sheriff, got any final words for the people watching at home?" Jamie looked around at his community, at Jack Davidson supporting his old friend Judge Harrison, at Linda and Tommy standing proud, at Torres and Sullivan coordinating with state and federal authorities. Then he looked directly into the camera, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that had made him a champion long before he'd pinned on a badge. "Just this. To any other corrupt officials thinking of using Bradford's playbook, remember Cedar Grove. Remember what happened when you underestimated a small town and a sheriff who spent his whole life learning to take the perfect shot. Because in these mountains, justice might take time, but like a well-aimed bullet, it always finds its mark." 1 month after Bradford's arrest, Cedar Grove hosted a different kind of gathering. Representatives from 20 small towns across the state filled the community center, each with their own story of resistance against corruption. The old building had been repaired after the shootout, its walls now displaying newspaper headlines chronicling Bradford's fall and the exposure of his statewide criminal enterprise. "The final numbers are in," FBI agent Wilson announced to the assembled crowd. 32 state officials indicted, 15 corrupt police commanders arrested, over $50 million in seized assets from Bradford's operation. But the real story isn't in the numbers. Jamie stood at the podium, his badge catching the morning light streaming through the windows. The same badge that some had once claimed he'd gotten through luck or connections now stood as a symbol of something larger. Proof that sometimes the most effective weapon against corruption isn't force, but unwavering precision and patience. "The real story," he continued, "is how a network of small towns brought down a statewide criminal enterprise. Not with gunfights, but with something stronger: unity, evidence, and the kind of courage that runs deeper than any badge or bullet." Judge Harrison stepped forward, holding up the legislation that had just passed the state assembly. "The Community Protection Act," he announced proudly. "It guarantees local law enforcement autonomy, requires transparency in state interventions, and establishes an independent oversight committee staffed by small-town representatives. And the FBI's new small-town defense unit," Torres added from her position by the door. "They're using our playbook, teaching communities how to spot corruption, build evidence, and protect themselves without losing their independence." Linda Miller, who'd turned her diner's basement command center into a permanent community security hub, stood up. "Tell them about the changes, Sheriff. Tell them what's happening across the state." Jamie moved to the evidence wall, now transformed into a teaching tool showing how community networks could overcome systemic corruption. Bradford thought he could use the iron wolves to break small towns. Instead, he showed us our strength. Last month alone, 2 attempts at organized corruption were stopped before they could even start. Communities recognized the signs, worked together, and protected each other. Sarah Chen, who'd won a regional journalism award for her coverage of the Bradford scandal, raised her hand. "And the shooting competitions, Sheriff? Will you go back to them now that this is over?" Jamie smiled, touching the worn spot on his belt where his competition holster used to ride. "No need. Those competitions taught me something invaluable. That precision under pressure isn't just about hitting targets. It's about having the patience to wait for the perfect moment, the wisdom to see patterns others miss, and the courage to take the shot when everything's on the line." Through the community center's windows, they could see Cedar Grove bustling with renewed life. The fair had been rebuilt, this time with permanent security features disguised as architectural improvements. Davidson's gun shop had reopened, now offering community defense classes alongside its regular inventory. Even O'Malley's Bakery had adapted, its basement converted into a neighborhood watch coordination center. "You know what Bradford never understood?" Jamie continued, watching his town thrive. "He thought controlling small towns was about breaking their spirit. He never realized that spirit is what makes us strongest. Every person in Cedar Grove played a part in bringing him down, from Linda's diner serving as our command center to Tommy Miller spotting those first suspicious bikes at his school." Judge Harrison, who'd known Jamie since he was a boy practicing shots behind his father's house, stood up. "Tell them about the legacy, son. Tell them what John would have wanted them to know." Jamie moved to the window, looking out at the mountains that had taught him everything he knew about patience and precision. "My father died trying to expose Bradford's corruption alone. He thought he had to protect everyone by himself, but he taught me something more valuable than any shooting technique. He taught me that true strength comes from community, from people standing together against those who'd try to rule through fear." A young deputy from a neighboring town raised her hand. "Sheriff Carson, you could have gone professional with your shooting skills. Instead, you chose to protect a small town." "Why?" "Because it works," Torres answered for him, gesturing to the wall of evidence. "Last month alone, 2 attempts at organized corruption were stopped before they could even get started. Communities recognized the signs, worked together, protected each other. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, but now it carried a different message. Not a warning of approaching storms, but a reminder of battles won and lessons learned. The rookie sheriff who'd outshot the Iron Wolves had helped create something that would outlast any single victory. A blueprint for communities standing strong against corruption, united in purpose, and protected by truth. The shooting skills, Jamie added, his hand resting on his holster. They were just tools. Important tools, but not the real weapon. The real weapon was information, evidence, and the unbreakable bonds between neighbors who refused to be intimidated. As the meeting continued, plans were made for expanding their network, for teaching other communities the signs of corruption, for ensuring that no other town would face what Cedar Grove had faced alone. Jamie watched it all with quiet satisfaction, knowing that his father would be proud not just of the shots he'd taken, but of the community he'd helped build. "One last thing," he announced as the gathering drew to a close. "Bradford's trial starts next month. They say he's hired the best lawyers money can buy, trying to claim he was set up. But you know what? He's about to learn the same lesson the Iron Wolves learned, that all the money and power in the world can't stand against the truth when it's backed by an entire community of witnesses." Linda stood up, Tommy now wearing a junior deputy badge on his chest. "And the Iron Wolves? What happened to them?" "Rodriguez and his top lieutenants turned state's evidence," Jamie replied. "Turns out when faced with federal charges, they had quite a lot to say about Bradford's operation. The rest of the gang? They're disbanded, their reputation destroyed. Turns out other criminal organizations aren't too keen on working with a gang that got outshot by a small-town sheriff." The thunder rolled one final time across the mountains. But in Cedar Grove, they'd learned to hear it differently. Not as nature's fury, but as a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories don't come from the fastest draw or the most powerful allies. They come from the quiet determination of people who decide to stand together, who turn precision into protection, and who prove that the strongest communities aren't the ones with the most weapons. They're the ones with the most unshakable spirit. As the representatives from other towns filed out, carrying with them the lessons and strategies that would help protect their own communities, Jamie remained at the window, watching storm clouds gather over the mountains. But these clouds didn't carry threats. They brought the promise of renewal, of strength, and of a legacy that would ensure no other town would have to stand alone against corruption. In Cedar Grove, they still tell stories about the sheriff who could outshoot any outlaw. But more importantly, they tell the story of a community that learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true justice isn't measured by the speed of a draw or the power of a badge, but by the courage of people who stand united against any threat to their freedom and way of life. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.